USS George Washington moves to the Middle East. Is China getting a temporary opening? The implications reach far beyond one ship and one deployment. A new development involving USS George Washington is drawing attention because the carrier, the only American aircraft carrier permanently forward deployed in Japan, has reportedly moved toward the Middle East. The move comes as USS Abraham Lincoln faces an unusually long deployment amid continuing U.S. operations involving Iran. According to military.com, George Washington transited from the South China Sea through the Strait of Malacca toward the Arabian Sea. Lincoln's deployment has reportedly stretched beyond 250 days, raising concerns about crew strain and the limits of keeping a carrier strike group at sea for so long. And here is the bigger question. Does this create a temporary opening for China? The answer is complicated. This does not mean the United States has abandoned the Indo-Pacific or that China suddenly has uncontested control of the region. American forces remain deployed across Japan, Guam, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, and elsewhere. Submarines, bombers, surveillance aircraft, surface ships, and allied forces can continue providing significant deterrence. But an aircraft carrier is different. It is a mobile airfield providing air defense, strike capability, surveillance, and a visible strategic message. That is why George Washington matters. The Western Pacific is strategically sensitive. China continues expanding its naval and air capabilities, conducting patrols and exercises. Beijing also watches American force movements because military readiness is not only about weapons, it is about availability. If one carrier moves out while another remains tied to an extended deployment elsewhere, the United States has fewer carrier options available for rapid reinforcement. This is the central issue: capacity. The United States Navy is a global force, but commitments can stretch even the most powerful military. Carrier strike groups require maintenance, crew rest, training, logistics, and rotation. The Middle East is demanding attention because of ongoing operations connected to Iran. The Indo-Pacific, meanwhile, remains a long-term strategic priority because of China. So Washington faces a difficult balancing act. Send the carrier toward the Middle East, and you strengthen U.S. power there, but temporarily reduce carrier presence in the Western Pacific. Keep it in the Pacific, and you preserve visible deterrence against China, but potentially leave another theater with fewer immediate options. That is the reality of managing a finite force against multiple crises. For China, even a temporary gap can be useful. A reduction in visible American presence can provide opportunities for intelligence collection, military observation, exercises, and strategic messaging. Chinese forces can watch how quickly Washington responds and how allied forces coordinate. But there is an important distinction between opportunity and vulnerability. A carrier gap does not automatically create a military advantage that China can exploit. The United States operates a distributed network of bases and allied forces. Japan hosts major American capabilities. Guam provides a strategic hub, and Australia and the Philippines remain important partners. American submarines and long-range aircraft can also operate with less visibility than a carrier. In other words, the carrier may leave the area, but American military power does not leave with it. There is also another factor: timing. If George Washington's movement is followed by another U.S. carrier deployment into the Indo-Pacific, the gap could be relatively short. The Navy can also increase the use of destroyers, submarines, aircraft, and land-based systems to compensate. The real story may not be one carrier. The real story is whether the United States can maintain credible deterrence while simultaneously responding to crises in different parts of the world. China may be watching most carefully. For Beijing, the lesson could be that American military power is enormous, but not unlimited. Every crisis creates competing demands, consuming ships, aircraft, fuel, maintenance capacity, and people. For Washington, the lesson may be equally important. A global strategy requires not only advanced weapons, but enough platforms and personnel to sustain them across multiple theaters. For the Philippines, this development is also worth watching. A temporary reduction in carrier presence does not mean the country is without U.S. support. Defense agreements, rotational deployments, exercises, intelligence cooperation, and access to Philippine facilities remain important. But it highlights why distributed defense matters. The future Indo-Pacific security network will increasingly depend on many systems working together. Fighters, frigates, missiles, surveillance platforms, unmanned systems, submarines, coastal defenses, and allied bases. There is another dimension that should not be overlooked: perception. In military strategy, perception can sometimes be almost as important as actual combat power. A carrier operating in the Western Pacific sends a highly visible signal to allies and potential adversaries. When that carrier moves thousands of kilometers away, countries across the region immediately begin evaluating what it means. For China, the movement provides an opportunity to test assumptions without necessarily taking direct action. Beijing could increase naval patrols, conduct larger air operations, intensify maritime surveillance, or expand military exercises in sensitive areas. These activities could allow Chinese commanders to gather information about how quickly American and allied forces react. But Washington also has options. The United States can compensate for the temporary carrier absence by increasing the operational tempo of other platforms. Air Force bombers can provide long-range strike capability. Fighter aircraft operating from regional bases can maintain air presence. Destroyers equipped with advanced sensors and missiles can continue maritime security missions. Submarines can provide another layer of deterrence while remaining difficult to detect. This means China cannot simply look at a map and conclude that American power has disappeared. However, the bigger concern is sustainability. If the Middle East crisis continues demanding additional American forces, the pressure on the Navy could become more serious. A carrier can remain deployed for months, but prolonged deployments eventually affect sailors, maintenance cycles, training schedules, and future readiness. That is why the reported strain surrounding Abraham Lincoln is significant. The United States has some of the world's most capable naval forces, but those forces still operate under physical limits. Ships need maintenance, aircraft need inspections, crews need rest, equipment needs replacement, and eventually, every deployed unit has to return home. For China, this creates a strategic calculation. Instead of asking whether it can defeat the United States in a direct confrontation, Beijing can study whether American commitments can be stretched across multiple theaters. That is particularly important in the Western Pacific, where geography already creates enormous distances. The United States, therefore, increasingly relies on allies and partners to create a distributed security network. Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and South Korea can provide bases, logistics, surveillance, and additional military capabilities. This is where the Philippine position becomes increasingly important. The Philippines sits close to critical maritime routes connecting the South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and the broader Western Pacific. Access, interoperability, and intelligence cooperation can therefore help compensate when a major American platform is temporarily absent. So the George Washington movement should not be viewed simply as a weakness. Instead, it is a reminder that modern deterrence depends on a network. The question is no longer just, where is the American carrier? The more important question is, how many other forces can continue operating effectively when the carrier is somewhere else? If the answer is many, then the temporary gap becomes manageable. If the answer is too few, China could gain a much larger strategic opportunity. And that is why this deployment deserves continued attention. The real test will be what happens next. Whether another carrier or major U.S. force quickly restores the Western Pacific presence, or whether the temporary gap becomes longer than expected. For Beijing, that difference could be extremely important. For Washington, it could become another reminder that maintaining global military power requires not only technological superiority, but sufficient numbers, readiness, and endurance. That could become especially important during a crisis, when a carrier may be thousands of kilometers away. So, is China benefiting from the movement of USS George Washington? In the short term, potentially yes. The temporary absence of an American carrier from the Western Pacific creates a visible gap and gives Beijing an opportunity to observe and assess. But calling it a U.S. strategic defeat would be premature. The bigger warning is about endurance. If crises continue demanding American forces in multiple regions, the United States will have to rotate limited high-end platforms more aggressively. That creates pressure not only on ships, but on sailors, maintenance schedules, logistics, and readiness. And that is why this carrier movement deserves attention. It is not simply about where one warship is sailing. It is about whether American power can remain present everywhere it is needed at the same time. And if that becomes increasingly difficult, China may not need to challenge the United States directly. It may simply wait for the next gap,